The photograph exists in exactly one archive in the world. It sits in a manila folder inside a grey archival box on the fourth floor of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture on 135th Street in Harlem. And if you request it through the proper channels and wait the proper amount of time and pull on the proper cotton gloves, a librarian will set it in front of you on a foam reading cradle, and you will look at it, and something in your understanding of American history will quietly and permanently rearrange itself. It shows a man standing in front of a microphone in Lagos, Nigeria. The year is 1964. He is wearing a dark suit, and his glasses catch the light at an angle that makes his eyes difficult to read. Around him, pressing close, are dozens of Nigerian university students, and they are not looking at him the way an audience looks at a speaker. They are looking at him the way people look at someone they recognize, not a celebrity, not a politician, something older than that, something that operates below the level of fame and celebrity and moves instead at the frequency of blood. One of the students in that photograph, a young man at the left edge of the frame, partially cut off, wearing a white agbada, is holding a piece of paper with something written on it in Yoruba. The paper says, Omowale. It means, the son who has come home. The man at the microphone had been born 39 years earlier in Omaha, Nebraska, in a two-story frame house on Pinckney Street that no longer exists, delivered into the world by a white doctor who wrote his name on a certificate in handwriting that has faded almost to invisibility. The name on that certificate was not Omowale. It was not El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. It was not even X. It was Little, Malcolm Little. And the question that nobody, not his biographers, not his daughters, not the scholars who have spent careers mapping the topology of his mind, nobody has ever fully answered, is this: what was the name before Little? Not the Arabic name he chose, not the X he weaponized, the name that existed before the auction block, before the plantation ledger, before the forced crossing of the Atlantic, before all of it. The name that a specific family in a specific place in Africa spoke aloud every morning for generations before a Portuguese or British or Dutch ship appeared on the horizon and the world they had built over centuries began to be systematically fed into a machine whose output was American wealth. That name is not in any archive. It is not in the Schomburg. It is not in the Library of Congress. It is not in the courthouse records of Taylor County, Georgia, where Malcolm's paternal line disappears into the red clay soil sometime around 1860, swallowed by a record-keeping system that was designed with bureaucratic elegance to make exactly this kind of disappearance permanent. But here is what the architects of that disappearance did not account for. They did not account for the molecule. Deoxyribonucleic acid does not require a courthouse. It does not need a census enumerator or a deed of sale or a baptismal record or any of the paper infrastructure that human societies construct to tell themselves who belongs to whom and what is owned by whom and which lives are worth recording in ink and which are worth recording only as numbers in a column-headed slave schedule. A phrase so banal, so administratively tidy, so completely stripped of the violence it describes that you have to say it several times before the full horror of it reaches you. Slave schedule, a schedule, like a train schedule, like a class schedule, a document you fill out and file and forget. In the slave schedule for Taylor County, Georgia, filed in 1860, there is a column for the name of the enslaver and a column for the number of enslaved people that person owned, and columns for age and sex and color, black or mulatto. Those are the two options. Those are the full range of human variation. The form was designed to capture, and there is no column for names because the people being counted were not, in the legal and administrative framework of the United States of America in the year 1860, people in any sense that required naming. Somewhere in that document, rendered as a tick mark in a column, is the person from whom Malcolm X descended on his father's side. One tick mark. That is what is left of them on paper. But in the blood, in the specific sequences of nucleotide bases that were copied and recopied and passed from parent to child through the slave cabin and the sharecropper's shack and the burned house in Lansing and the prison cell in Massachusetts and the mosque in Detroit and all the way to the podium in Lagos, where a young man in a white agbada is holding up a piece of paper. In the blood, the full record is preserved. Every generation, every ancestor, every migration, every origin point. And the blood tells a story that the slave schedule was specifically designed to prevent anyone from ever knowing. To read that story, you have to start not in Nebraska, not in Georgia, not even on the Atlantic coast, where the ships loaded their cargo and turned west. You have to start in a place that Malcolm X himself was moving toward in the last year of his life, following some instinct he could not have named, but that the DNA would have recognized immediately. The way a compass needle doesn't decide to point north. It simply does, because the field is there, because the pull is real, because the physics of the thing don't require your permission or your understanding. You have to start in a city made of red earth and bronze. You have to start at the place the Yoruba people call the center of the world. But before we go there, before we follow the genetic thread all the way back to its source, we need to walk the paper trail to its absolute end. We need to stand at the wall. We need to feel the full weight of what the archive preserved and what it destroyed. Because unless you have felt that weight, the DNA reveal is just data. And this is not a data story. This is a story about a man who spent his entire adult life conducting the most important investigation of his era without ever having access to the most important evidence. He was the detective and the case. He was asking the question, and he was the answer. He just never had the tools to see it. Earl Little, Malcolm's father, was born in 1890 in Reynolds, Georgia, which is the county seat of Taylor County, a place of red laterite roads and pine forests and a particular quality of summer heat that sits on your chest like something with intent. Earl was a large man, dark-skinned, physically imposing in a way that made white men in the Jim Crow South uncomfortable in ways they converted immediately into hostility. He was also, from a young age, a man who had decided that the framework being offered to Black Americans, the framework of submission and patience and incremental progress and the careful management of white discomfort, was a framework he was not going to operate within. He became a Baptist preacher. He became, more importantly, a field organizer for Marcus Mosiah Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, the largest mass movement in African American history, a movement built on the radical and at the time almost unthinkable proposition that Black people were not a problem to be solved by white liberal benevolence, but a nation to be built, a people with a history and a dignity and a continental inheritance that preceded and exceeded everything that had been done to them in the Americas. Earl Little drove through the towns of the Midwest in the 1920s, standing up in Black churches and telling Black people that Africa was not a place of shame, that Africa was home, that the names they had been given were not their names, that the story they had been told about themselves was not their story. He was repeating, with the specific urgency of a man who has felt the thing he is describing, something that his own ancestors had known, and that the slave schedule and the plantation system and the entire administrative machinery of American anti-blackness had spent 2 centuries trying to make him forget. He did not know where, in Africa. He could not have told you. Nobody had given him the tools, but he felt the direction of the pull, the way you feel the direction of wind, even inside a room with no windows, something moving through the walls. The clan came for Earl Little in Omaha in 1929, surrounding the house on horseback at night, calling for him by name, their horse's breath making small clouds in the cold Nebraska air. Louise was pregnant with Malcolm. She stood in the doorway of that house. Earl was away, preaching. She faced them. Think about that for a moment. A pregnant woman facing a line of men on horses in the dark in 1929, Nebraska. The specific texture of that terror, the specific quality of that courage. Where does that come from? What is it made of? The family moved. They moved to Lansing. They moved because they had to, and because Earl refused to stop organizing, and because the UNIA was considered, by the FBI and by every white power structure in the Midwest, a threat significant enough to warrant the kind of sustained harassment that eventually expresses itself through arson and through bodies found on streetcar tracks. The house in Lansing was burned in 1929. A white neighbor called to warn them just before the fire was set, and they got out, and they stood in the Michigan cold and watched everything they owned become ash and heat and orange light in the faces of their children. Malcolm was 4 years old. He watched his father stand in front of the burning house with a shotgun because there was nothing else to do. And the image, his father, the fire, the gun, the cold, entered him at a depth that is below memory, below narrative, below the reach of language. It became part of the material he was made of. 2 years later, Earl Little was dead. His body was found on the streetcar tracks in Lansing. The official story was accident. The family knew what the official story was worth. Louise knew. She had been a woman who knew exactly what official stories were worth her entire life, having grown up in Grenada under British colonial administration, which was itself one long official story told to justify something that defied justification. Louise Norton had been born in Grenada in 1897, the daughter of a black Grenadian woman and a white man whose name history has swallowed. She was educated, politically conscious, fiercely proud, in a way that the specific circumstance of Caribbean colonial society both produced and punished. She came to the United States in the early 20th century, and she brought with her a diasporic identity, an Afro-Caribbean sense of self, that was different in texture from the African-American identity she married into, not lesser, not greater, but differently shaped by a different colonial history, a different island geography, a different relationship to the African past. Her complexion was light, light enough that her son would later write about it with the particular anguish of a man who has spent years trying to work out his feelings about something that was done to his family generations before he was born. Her light complexion was the direct genetic result of what colonial sexual violence looks like when it is passed through enough generations to become simply a physical fact, a trait, something a child grows up seeing in the mirror without initially understanding what it records. Malcolm understood it eventually. He understood it with the cold clarity of someone who decides to follow every implication of an uncomfortable truth all the way to its end, regardless of where it goes. His mother's Grenadian heritage is not incidental to the DNA story. It is a second river feeding the same delta. The enslaved Africans taken to Grenada came through the French and then British colonial pipeline, a system that drew from overlapping but distinct regions of the West African coast compared to the American trade that ran through Charleston and Savannah. Grenada's African population was drawn heavily from the Bight of Benin, from the Congo-Angola region, from the Gold Coast. These populations are distinct in their genetic signatures, their languages, their spiritual systems, and their material cultures, and they are all present, in differing proportions, in Louise Norton's mitochondrial line, the line that passes exclusively from mother to child, unchanged, uncontaminated by paternal genetics, a pure maternal thread, running back through every generation of women, from Louise all the way to a single woman in Africa, who was the common ancestor of everyone in that line. Geneticists call her the mitochondrial Eve of the lineage. She was not mythological. She was a specific woman. She had a name. She lived in a specific place. She had children, and those children had children. And the thread ran forward through time and space, and across an ocean, and through the institution of slavery, and through a Grenadian childhood, and through a pregnancy in Omaha in 1929, and into a boy named Malcolm, who would spend the rest of his life, without knowing it, trying to find his way back to her. But to follow that thread to its source, we have to do something that the paper archive cannot do. We have to go into the blood. And before we do, we have to understand something about the specific geography of the slave trade, something that most Americans, including most African Americans, were never taught, because the history of the trade was for a very long time taught, when it was taught at all, from the perspective of the ships and the economics and the abolitionists, almost never from the perspective of the specific African communities that were targeted, dismantled, and fed into the machine. Because to teach it from that perspective would require acknowledging that what was destroyed was not a collection of primitive villages in a pre-civilizational wilderness, but something far more difficult and far more damning to the legacy of Western civilization. It would require acknowledging that the slave trade did not simply steal labor. It stole history. It stole cities. It stole kingdoms. And in the specific case of the genetic inheritance that flows through the blood of Malcolm X, through Earl Little's Georgia line and Louise Norton's Grenadian line, two rivers converging in a child born in Nebraska in 1925. What was stolen was citizenship in one of the most consequential civilizations in the history of the African continent. The Yoruba. The talking drum knows your name before you do. That is not a metaphor. In the traditional communication system of Yoruba civilization, the dundun drum, a tension drum played under the arm, its pitch controlled by the pressure of the strings against the body, was capable of reproducing the tonal patterns of spoken Yoruba with enough precision to transmit complex messages across miles of forest and farmland. It was a telegraph made of wood and skin, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of drummers who had memorized the tonal signature of every important name, every royal lineage, every clan identifier in the network of Yoruba city-states. When a person of consequence arrived at a new town, the drummer would play their name into the air before they spoke a word. The community knew who was coming before they arrived. Malcolm X arrived in Lagos in May of 1964, and the students at the University of Ibadan gave him the name Omowale, and he received it with something on his face that his biographers have described as unusual: a man not easily moved, a man who had trained himself to meet every moment with a kind of controlled analytical intensity, briefly undone, briefly something else, something that looked less like a public intellectual receiving an honorary title and more like a person hearing a sound they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. The son who has come home. He had been looking for the door his entire life. In that moment, in Lagos, on Nigerian soil, surrounded by Yoruba students who saw in him something that the American context had never had the framework to name properly, he found it. He walked through it. And 11 months later, on February 21st, 1965, in the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan, they killed him. He was 39 years old. He had just begun a sentence. The DNA does not grieve. The DNA simply records. And what it records in the specific sequences that were passed from the unnamed woman on the 1860 slave schedule in Taylor County, Georgia, forward through John Little and Earl Little and into Malcolm. What it records is an unbroken line of transmission from the court cities of Yoruba land to a podium in Harlem. Every generation that survived the unsurvivable. Every ancestor who held the thread and passed it forward into a darkness they could not see through, but that they passed it into anyway, because that is what humans do when they have no other tool left. They pass the thread. The X was never an absence. Malcolm said it was. He meant it as he said it. He constructed it as an absence, a mathematical symbol for the unknown, a variable standing in for the thing that had been taken. And in the context of what American slavery had done to the documentary record, to the names, to the languages, to the cosmologies, to the entire apparatus of self-knowledge, he was exactly right. But the variable had a value. It was always there, encoded at a level below the reach of plantation ledgers and census schedules and courthouse fires. It survived in the molecule. It waited in the helix. And the value, when you solve for it, when you follow the genetic evidence through the Yoruba ancestry on the paternal line and the Bight of Benin inheritance on the maternal line, and the specific confluence of West African populations that the DNA reveals in the blood of Earl and Louise Little's seventh child. The value is a civilization, not a village, not a tribe in the diminishing colonial sense of that word. A civilization with bronze portrait sculpture and constitutional monarchy and a spiritual system sophisticated enough to cross an ocean intact and rebuild itself in a dozen different languages across 4 continents and still be recognizable 200 years later in the rhythm of a Black Baptist choir in Georgia, in the way a candomblé ceremony in Salvador. Brazil moves through its stages with the same structural logic as a Yoruba Orisha festival in Ile-Ife. That is what the X was standing in for. That is what was taken. And here is the thought that will not leave you once you have followed this investigation to its end. The thought that sits down inside you and makes itself permanent. Malcolm X built his entire philosophy on the logical shape of a crime he could feel but could not fully document. He looked at the size of the psychological damage, the self-hatred, the internalized inferiority, the desperate hunger for white validation that he saw in Black American communities in the 1950s, and diagnosed with a clinical precision that made white liberals deeply uncomfortable. And he reasoned backward from the damage to the weapon. He said, an injury this deep required a civilization this large to destroy. You do not spend 4 centuries systematically dismantling a people's sense of themselves unless that sense of self, if left intact, would have been powerful enough to make the entire project of white supremacy impossible to sustain. The DNA confirms the reasoning. The civilization was that large. The weapon had to be that systematic. And the son who came home to Lagos in 1964, the man standing in front of that microphone in the photograph in the Schomburg archive, The man whose eyes catch the light at an angle that makes them difficult to read was not a man who had been shaped by absence. He was a man who had been shaped by the force of what was missing, which is not the same thing, which is in fact the opposite thing. Absence is passive, force is not. The gravity of a removed civilization pulls on everything around the hole it leaves. It pulls on the descendants. It pulled on Malcolm. It made him orbit the truth of his own origins for 39 years, getting closer and closer, moving from the Nation of Islam's invented cosmology toward the genuine Pan-Africanism of his final year, toward Lagos, toward Ibadan, toward the students who gave him a Yoruba name and saw him clearly in a way that required no explanation. Omowale. The drum would have played it into the air before he arrived, in the old way. The community would have known he was coming. The blood always knew.